The air in the co-op cafe was thick with the smell of stale coffee, bacon grease, and the damp wool of chore coats. It was March of '76, a raw, wet month that kept men off the fields and huddled around the orange formica tables, nursing lukewarm mugs and trading gossip. Earl Jensen sat alone at the counter, stirring a spoonful of sugar into his black coffee, the spoon making a quiet scraping sound against the heavy ceramic. He was listening, the way a man does when he knows he's the subject of the conversation, but is too proud to turn and face it. The loudest voice belonged to Frank Miller. Frank was 10 years younger than Earl, with a full head of dark hair and the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of things going his way. He was holding court from the big round table in the corner, his new green and yellow seed corn hat pushed back on his head. "And the dealer said it's the first 8630 delivered in the whole county," Frank boomed, his voice echoing off the linoleum floor. "Thing's a monster. Pulled the 24-foot disc yesterday just to see what she'd do. Barely even knew it was back there. The sound guard body, I'm telling you. It's like sitting in your living room. Got the radio on, the air conditioning blowing. It's the future, boys." A murmur of agreement went around the table. Men who farmed a couple hundred acres with John Deere 4020s and International 1066 looked at Frank with a mixture of envy and awe. He'd just bought the old Henderson place, another 320 acres adjoining his own, and everyone knew he'd paid top dollar for it. The bank, they whispered, was backing him all the way. "What's that beast got in her, Frank?" asked old man Hemmings, cupping a hand to his ear. "A 5 31 cubic inch John Deere diesel. Turbocharged and intercooled. Puts out 225 horse at the drawbar. 275 at the engine," Frank said, savouring the numbers like fine whiskey. "Makes that old green thing of Earl's look like a garden tractor." The men chuckled, and a few of them glanced over at the counter. Earl didn't move. He just took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling the heat of it go all the way down. His green thing was a 1969 Steiger Bearcat too. He'd bought it used 6 years ago, paid cash. It was built like a locomotive, a simple, brutal machine with a big Caterpillar 3160 V8 diesel that put out a respectable 180 horsepower. It was loud, it was clumsy on the headlands, and the cab was just a steel box to keep most of the rain off. But it was his. Every nut, every bolt, every grease-stained fitting belonged to him and him alone. "Heard you had that old dinosaur in the shed all last week, Earl," Frank called out, finally addressing him directly. The cafe went quiet. "Couldn't get her started?" Earl turned slowly on his stool. He looked at Frank, at the shiny new hat, the clean work shirt, the soft hands that hadn't seen a busted knuckle in years. "She starts," Earl said, his voice a low rumble, "just giving her a spring tune-up. New filters, changed the fluids. You ought to try it sometime." Frank laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Don't need to. I got a warranty. Something breaks. I call the dealer and a man in a clean uniform shows up in a service truck. You ought to try that sometime, Earl. Get with the times. Farming's a business now, not a hobby. You can't make money turning wrenches when you should be turning soil." "My time's my own," Earl said, turning back to his coffee. "Costs me less than a service call." "Costs you a whole planting season if you're not careful," another farmer chimed in. "You can't cover 1,000 acres with that old iron." "I only farm my own 640, Earl replied, his voice flat. "And it gets done, every year." Frank stood up, tossing $1 on the table for his coffee. He walked over to the counter and stood next to Earl, clapping him on the shoulder. It wasn't a friendly gesture, it was a display of dominance. "Look, Earl, I'm not trying to be a hard nose. I just hate to see a good man get left behind. The USDA says get big or get out. Land prices are only going one way. We're feeding the world now. You could double your acreage, triple your income. The bank is practically giving money away. You could trade that Steiger in, get yourself a real tractor. One that doesn't leak oil on your boots." Earl looked down at his worn leather work boots. There was, in fact, a dark stain of 30-weight oil near the toe of the right one. He looked back up at Frank's polished boots. "This farm was my father's," he said quietly, "and his father's before him. They didn't get big, they just got by. They stayed, and they didn't owe any man a dime when they died. I aim for the same. Frank shook his head, a pitying smile on his face. Suit yourself. But don't come crying to me when that cat engine of yours throws a rod and you're waiting 3 weeks for parts while my new deer is putting the crop in the ground. He patted Earl's shoulder again, harder this time. Some of us are trying to build something here. An empire. He walked out, the screen door slamming behind him, leaving a wake of silence. The other farmers avoided Earl's eyes, shuffling their feet and finding sudden interest in the salt shakers on their tables. They saw Earl as a relic, a stubborn old mule refusing to leave a burning barn. He was a good neighbor, a decent man, but he was a fossil. In the booming agricultural economy of 1976, his caution looked like cowardice. His independence looked like foolishness. Earl finished his coffee, the dregs cold and bitter in the bottom of the cup. He laid a pair of quarters on the counter and walked out into the grey March morning. The wind had a sharp edge to it, carrying the smell of damp earth and the promise of a spring that was still weeks away. He could hear the distant rumble of Frank Miller's new 8630, already working a field on the horizon, its engine a smooth, powerful hum. He got into his '71 Ford F-250, the one with the 390 V8 and the 4-speed manual. The door groaned on its hinges. The seat springs were shot. The radio only got one station, and only when it felt like it. He started it up, the engine turning over with a familiar throaty roar. He didn't drive toward his farm. Instead, he drove past Frank's place. The new tractor was magnificent, he had to admit. It moved across the wet, dark soil with an effortless grace, the dual wheels on all 4 corners barely seeming to disturb the ground as it pulled the massive disc harrow. It was a beautiful, efficient, and astronomically expensive machine, and every inch of it belonged to the Production Credit Association. Before we go any further, and I tell you about the greasy, knuckle-bloodying struggle that was coming for Earl, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where you had to stand your ground, holding on to a principle or a belief that everyone around you, people you've known your whole life, insisted was outdated and wrong? Drop a comment below and tell me about it. Because that's the lonely road Earl Jensen was walking down as he drove away from the co-op that day. The sound of modern progress fading in his rearview mirror. 2 weeks later, the sun finally broke through. The fields began to dry, and the frantic energy of planting season descended on the county. Tractors ran from dawn until well after dusk, their lights like lonely stars moving across the vast, dark landscape. Frank Miller's operation was a sight to behold. His new 8630 ran around the clock. He hired a young kid to run it on the night shift, pulling a 24-row planter, a piece of equipment so wide it had to be folded up to go down the road. Frank was a blur of motion, racing between fields in his new pickup, coordinating seed and fertilizer deliveries, a general commanding his army. Earl, by contrast, was a one-man band. He started on the North 80, the same field his grandfather had first broken, with a team of mules. His Steiger roared to life each morning, billowing a cloud of black smoke that soon thinned to a grey haze. The Caterpillar V8 didn't hum, it hammered. It was a raw, mechanical symphony of controlled explosions, a sound that vibrated right through the soles of your boots. He was pulling a 12-row International planter, a good, solid piece of equipment he'd bought at a farm sale years ago. He moved at a steady, unhurried pace. He wasn't setting any speed records, but the rows went in straight and true. The trouble started on the 3rd day. He was halfway across a 160-acre field when he felt it. A lurch, a sudden violent shudder that ran through the tractor's articulated frame, followed by a sound like a giant wrench being thrown into a set of gears. A grinding, metallic shriek, he immediately stomped on the clutch and pulled the throttle back. The cat engine idled down, but the awful noise was replaced by a dead silence. The tractor coasted to a stop. Earl sat there for a long minute, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine and the cry of a red-winged blackbird on a nearby fence post. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a universal joint letting go. He climbed down from the cab, his heart sinking. Lying on the dark soil beneath the front drive shaft was a mangled cross of steel and a spray of needle bearings that looked like scattered silver teeth. The front U-joint on the main shaft connecting the transmission to the front axle had disintegrated. The Steiger was now a two-wheel drive tractor with a broken front end. It wasn't going anywhere. He walked the half-mile back to the house, the frustration a bitter taste in his mouth. He could hear Frank Miller's taunts in his head. "Costs you a whole planting season." He got his tools, the big floor jack, and a set of heavy-duty jack stands, and loaded them into the bed of his Ford. Back at the field, the work began. The drive shaft on that old Steiger was a beast, thick as a man's thigh and heavy as sin. He chocked the wheels, jacked up the front half of the frame, and slid underneath on a piece of cardboard. The air was cool, but soon sweat was dripping from his forehead, tracing clean paths through the grime on his face. The bolts holding the yokes were seized with years of rust and torque. He soaked them in penetrating oil, waited, then put a 3-foot breaker bar on his 1-inch socket. He braced his feet against the massive tire and pulled. The bolt didn't budge. He pulled again, his back and shoulders screaming, every muscle straining until he felt a slight give. It wasn't the bolt. It was the socket, splitting under the strain. He swore, the words swallowed by the open space of the field. He drove the 20 miles into town to the Napa store. The kid behind the counter, a teenager with a wispy mustache, had never seen a 1-inch drive impact socket that big. He had to look it up in a dusty catalogue. They could order it. It would be there in 3 days. 3 days. In the middle of planting. It felt like 3 years. Earl bought the socket and 2 new U-joints, hoping the kid ordered the right ones. The parts for a 69 Steiger weren't exactly flying off the shelves. For the next 3 days, Earl was a ghost haunting his own farm. He used his old Farmall M, a tractor his father had bought new in 1951, to pull a 6-row planter on the smaller fields close to the house. It was painfully slow. The M was a good tractor, reliable as a sunrise, but it was from another era. It had no cab, and by the end of the day, Earl's face was caked in dust, and his ears were ringing from the unmuffled bark of the 4-cylinder engine. Every time a car or truck went by on the county road, he felt their eyes on him. He saw them slow down to look at the big, crippled Steiger sitting dead in the middle of the field. He could imagine the conversations at the co-op. "Yep, saw old Earl's Steiger broke down, right in the middle of the Henderson field. Frank Miller's already got his corn up on the next section over." The scorn had turned to a kind of morbid satisfaction for some. They had told him so. His stubborn pride had finally caught up with him. His wife, Martha, brought him sandwiches and iced tea in the field. She didn't say much, but he could see the worry in her eyes. She'd been a farmer's daughter and was now a farmer's wife. She understood the tyranny of the calendar, the unforgiving nature of a planting window. "Frank finished his corn yesterday," she said softly, handing him a glass. "Good for him," Earl grunted, not looking at her. He was greasing the fittings on the old Farmall, his hands black with grease. "The banker called," she said. "Mr. Henderson, just asking how things were going." Earl stopped, the grease gun held tight in his fist. Henderson, the man who held his operating note. A small note, just enough for seed and fertilizer, but a note nonetheless. The news of his breakdown had traveled fast. "You tell him we're doing just fine," Earl said, his voice tight. "You tell him we'll be done by the end of the week." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The new socket arrived on a Friday. Earl drove back to the field, the precious tool on the seat beside him. With the impact socket and a long-handled ratchet, the bolts finally broke loose with a crack like a pistol shot. He wrestled the heavy shaft out from under the tractor, carried it to his workshop, and spent the next 4 hours pressing out the old shattered joint and carefully installing the new one, packing it with grease until it oozed from the seals. He did the same for the rear joint, not wanting to take any chances. By the time he got the shaft reinstalled, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. He was exhausted, his muscles ached, and his knuckles were raw and bleeding from a dozen slips of the wrench. He climbed into the cab, turned the key, and pushed the starter button. The big Cat V8 spun, caught, and erupted into its familiar deafening roar. He put the tractor in gear, let out the clutch, and it moved. All 4 massive wheels dug into the earth and pulled. He worked until 2 in the morning, the tractor's headlights cutting a lonely swath through the darkness. He finished that field and moved to the next. He kept that pace for the rest of the week, sleeping 4 hours a night, living on coffee and Martha's sandwiches. He finished planting the last of his 640 acres on a cool evening in late May, nearly 2 weeks behind schedule. As he drove the Steiger back to the machine shed, he saw that the corn on Frank Miller's land was already 6 inches high, a perfect, uniform carpet of vibrant green. His own fields were still just dark, bare soil. He had won the battle with the U-joint, but he felt like he was losing the war. The years that followed seemed to prove the coffee shop prophets right. The late 1970s were a golden age for American agriculture, or so it seemed. Grain prices, fueled by massive sales to the Soviet Union, shot through the roof. Corn was $3 a bushel, then $3.50. Soybeans hit $8. Land that Earl's father had paid $100 an acre for was now selling for $2,000, then $3. The mantra from Washington was, "Plant fence row to fence row," and men like Frank Miller were happy to oblige. Frank became the undisputed king of the county. He used his soaring profits and the ever-increasing value of his land as collateral to borrow more, buy more, and build more. He traded his 2-year-old 8630 for a brand-new John Deere 8640. Boasting over 300 horsepower, he bought the biggest combine John Deere made, an 8820, a titanic machine that could harvest 12 rows of corn at a time. He bought another quarter section of land from a retiring farmer, paying a price that made old-timers gasp. He built a new brick ranch-style house for his family, complete with a 2-car garage and central air conditioning. He was the living embodiment of the new American farmer, a businessman, an executive, a master of leverage and expansion. He and his wife took winter vacations to Florida. His kids had new clothes and new bicycles. When he came into the co-op, men fell silent to listen to him talk about commodity markets and depreciation schedules. His success was so total, so blinding, that it reshaped the values of the community. Debt was no longer a dirty word, it was a tool. Caution was no longer a virtue, it was a weakness. Through all of this, Earl Jensen just kept on farming. The good prices helped him, just like everyone else. But he didn't use the windfall to expand. He used it to pay off his small operating note ahead of schedule. He used it to build a solid cushion in his savings account at the local bank. He didn't buy new land. He didn't buy new equipment. When the engine in his old C60 grain truck started burning oil, he didn't trade it in. He ordered a rebuild kit and spent a week in his shop that winter, hoisting the block out with a chainfall, honing the cylinders, and fitting new pistons and rings himself. He put new sickle sections on his old Minneapolis Moline haybine. He welded cracks in his plow frame. He kept the Steiger, the Farmall, and his Oliver 1650 in perfect running order, replacing worn parts, keeping the fluids clean, and storing them inside. To his neighbors, his behavior was baffling. The mockery of the early years slowly curdled into a kind of pity. They saw him as a man who lacked ambition, who was too scared or too stubborn to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. Frank Miller would sometimes see Earl out on his old Steiger and just shake his head with a smirk. "Poor old Earl," he'd say at the coffee shop, still playing in the little leagues. "He's going to wake up one day and realize the world left him behind." Earl heard the talk. He felt the pity. But he also felt something else, the solid, reassuring weight of his paid-off deeds in the bank's safe deposit box. He felt the peace of mind that came from knowing that the only person he was beholden to was himself. He watched Frank and the others chase bigger and bigger numbers, leveraging their paper profits into mountains of real debt, and a quiet unease settled in his gut. It felt unsustainable, like a tree growing too fast, its branches spreading far beyond what its roots could support. One evening in the fall of 1979, after a long day of harvest, Earl sat in his worn armchair, listening to the news on the radio. The reception was fuzzy, but the announcer's voice was grave. He was talking about inflation, about interest rates, about a new chairman of the Federal Reserve named Paul Volcker who was promising to break inflation's back, no matter the cost. The announcer mentioned something called the prime rate, and the number he quoted was staggering: 15%. Earl leaned forward, turning the volume up. Martha looked over from her knitting, a questioning look on her face. He didn't say anything, just listened intently. The next day at the grain elevator, he overheard two younger farmers talking. Their operating loans for the next season had just been renewed, not at a fixed rate, but at a variable rate, 2 points above prime. They were laughing about it, nervously. "Can you believe it? 17%. They're crazy," one of them said. Earl didn't say a word. He just cashed his grain check, deposited most of it, and drove home. That evening, as the sun went down, he walked out to the edge of his fields. The harvest was done. The land was quiet, resting under a blanket of stubble. He looked over at the horizon, where the security lights of Frank Miller's massive new farmstead glowed against the darkening sky. A cold wind rustled the dry leaves in the trees along the fence row. It felt like the first chill of a long, hard winter that had nothing to do with the weather. The first sign of trouble came not as a roar, but as a whisper on the radio. In January of 1980, President Carter announced an embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. At the co-op, Frank Miller scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "A political stunt. It won't last. The world needs our corn." He was leveraged to the hilt, having just bought another 240 acres at a record-breaking $4,000 an acre. His confidence, like his credit line, seemed infinite. But the whisper grew louder. The markets, which had been a steady, exhilarating climb, suddenly faltered. Prices slid, then tumbled. By spring, the $3 corn that had built Frank's empire was a distant memory. The new price struggled to stay above $2.50, and every penny it dropped was like a stone pulled from the foundation of his finances. The 17% variable interest rate on his loans, once a nervous joke, was now a ticking bomb. Then the sky turned against them. The spring rains were sparse, and by June, the sun was a merciless white disk in a hazy, cloudless sky. Day after day, it baked the fields. The young corn, which had sprung up in perfect, vibrant green rows, began to show stress. The broad leaves, which should have been reaching for the sky, started to curl inward during the heat of the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. They took on a sickly, greyish-green tint. The air grew thick with the fine dust that blew off the overworked fields. Earl watched his own crops struggle, a familiar worry tightening his chest. He cultivated his rows with his old Oliver, trying to break the crust on the soil to preserve what little moisture was left. His Steiger sat idle, its work done for now. He was worried, but he wasn't panicked. His break-even point was low. He had no massive payments to make. He just had to weather the storm, or in this case, the lack of one. Frank Miller's operation, however, couldn't afford to slow down. He was running his big 8640 day and night, pulling a massive cultivator, trying to cover his thousands of acres. One sweltering afternoon in late June, it happened. The young man Frank had hired to run the tractor saw a warning light flash on the sophisticated console inside the air-conditioned sound guard cab. A moment later, a high-pitched whine started from beneath the tractor, and the steering grew heavy and unresponsive. He shut it down immediately. When Frank arrived, a dark stain of hydraulic fluid was spreading in the dust under the belly of the machine. It wasn't a simple hose leak. The main hydraulic pump, a complex pressure-compensated unit that powered everything from the steering and brakes to the three-point hitch, had failed catastrophically. Frank, for all his talk of business and efficiency, stared at the silent green giant with the helpless look of a man who had no idea what was under the hood. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He called the dealer. The service truck didn't arrive for 2 days. The dealership was swamped. The new, complex machines that had been sold on the promise of trouble-free productivity were breaking down all over the county under the strain of round-the-clock work in the brutal heat. When the mechanic finally got there, he confirmed Frank's fears. The pump was shot, and it had likely sent metal shavings throughout the entire hydraulic system. It would all have to be flushed. The pump itself would have to be ordered from the regional parts depot in Moline. It would take a week, maybe longer. The estimated repair bill was over $5,000. For 10 days, the most powerful tractor in the county sat dead in the field, a monument to broken promises. The weeds in Frank's uncultivated fields, hardier than the corn, exploded in the heat, stealing what little water and nutrients remained. Frank's famous confidence began to crack. His face was drawn and pale. He snapped at his wife, at his hired man, at the parts manager at the dealership. The bank manager, Mr. Henderson, started calling him daily, his voice no longer full of cheerful encouragement, but a cold, clinical concern. The interest on Frank's loans was accumulating at a rate of over $300 a day, whether the tractor ran or not. Earl saw it all from a distance. He finished his own cultivating, the steady chug of his Oliver a comforting rhythm in the oppressive silence of the drought. One evening, he drove his pickup down the road past Frank's place. He saw the disabled 8640, and he saw Frank standing beside it, his shoulders slumped, staring at the dying rows of his corn. There was no triumph in Earl's heart. There was only a deep, profound sorrow. He knew he was looking at a man who had built his house on sand, and the tide was coming in. The harvest of 1980 was a disaster. The drought had slashed yields by a third across the county. The price of corn, already low, collapsed further as every farmer, desperate for cash flow, flooded the elevators at the same time. It was a bloodbath. For Earl, it was a losing year. He sold his grain, paid his property taxes, and put enough aside for next year's seed. The savings he had painstakingly built were diminished, but they were still there. The farm was secure. He tightened his belt and prepared for another tough year. For Frank Miller, it was the beginning of the end. His massive harvest, even before the drought, was predicated on getting top dollar. At $2.20 a bushel, with his yields cut, he couldn't even cover his interest payments, let alone the principal on his loans for land and equipment. The $5,000 repair bill for the tractor was just salt in the wound. He was forced to take out another loan, at an even higher rate, just to cover the operating note from the previous year. He was drowning. The next 2 years were a slow, agonizing descent. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, held fast. The prime interest rate hovered near 20%. Land values, the bedrock of agricultural lending, crumbled. The acres Frank had paid $4,000 for were now appraised at $1,500, then $1,000. He was upside down on everything he owned. The bank, which had once courted him, now saw him as a liability. The letters started arriving, first polite reminders, then stern warnings. Finally, the certified letter that every farmer dreads, a notice of foreclosure. The empire was collapsing. The bank scheduled a public auction to liquidate all of Frank Miller's assets. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a miserable Saturday in November of '82. It seemed the whole county was there, not out of spite, but out of a kind of morbid curiosity and a shared sense of fear. They gathered in Frank's meticulously maintained machine shed, surrounded by the tools of his ambition. The John Deere 8640, barely 3 years old, stood gleaming under the fluorescent lights, its hydraulic pump repaired, but its owner broken. The massive 8820 combine, the 24-row planter, the fleet of shiny grain trucks, they were all lined up, each with a numbered tag. Frank stood near the back with his wife, his face a stony mask. He had lost 50 pounds, and his once confident eyes were hollow. Men who had once clapped him on the back and hung on his every word now shuffled past him, avoiding his gaze, offering quiet, awkward murmurs of sympathy. Earl was there, standing by himself near the doorway. He hadn't come to gloat. He had come to bear witness. He watched as the auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, began to chant. The bidding started low. The crowd was cautious. Money was tight for everyone. A planter that Frank had paid $60,000 for sold for $20,000. The grain trucks went for half their value. It was a slaughter. Then they came to the 8640. The auctioneer sang its praises, listing its features, its horsepower, its low hours. But the farmers were wary. They knew its story. They knew the cost of its upkeep. The bidding was sluggish, topping out at a price that was less than a third of what Frank still owed on it. Earl didn't bid on the big machinery. He had no need for it. He waited. Towards the end of the sale, they started on the smaller items, the contents of the workshop. Frank's tools were magnificent, rolling chests full of snap-on wrenches and sockets, specialty tools for engine work, a heavy-duty press. This was a collection built with pride. When the auctioneer started the bidding on the main toolbox, Earl raised his hand. He kept it raised, nodding silently, outbidding a few local mechanics, until the auctioneer finally shouted, "Sold." After the auctioneer moved on, Earl walked over to Frank. He pulled a roll of cash from his pocket. "Frank," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "I bought your tools." Frank looked at him, his eyes glassy. "Why, Earl? You've got your own tools." "A man needs his tools," Earl said, pressing the money into Frank's hand. He had paid more than they were worth. "This isn't charity, it's a loan. You pay me back when you get back on your feet." A single tear traced a path through the grime on Frank's cheek. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, clutching the money as if it were a lifeline. The final piece to be sold was the land. It was offered up in parcels. When the auctioneer announced the 320-acre Henderson place, the one that adjoined Earl's property, a hush fell over the crowd. This was prime land. Earl stepped forward. He made the opening bid, a low but respectable number based on the new, harsh reality of land values. A few others bid against him, but Earl was relentless. He wasn't bidding with the bank's money. He was bidding with a decade of saved profits, of winters spent turning wrenches instead of flying to Florida. His final bid was the last one. The Henderson place was his. He hadn't conquered it. He had reclaimed it. In the years that followed, the landscape of the county changed. For sale signs dotted the county roads like mournful flags. The farm crisis hollowed out the community, taking with it a generation of farmers who had believed in the gospel of leverage. Frank Miller lost everything. He and his family moved to the city, where he got a job as a diesel mechanic. He was good with his hands, it turned out. The conversations at the co-op cafe were different now. The talk was no longer of horsepower and expansion, but of survival. The men who remained were the ones who, like Earl, had been cautious. They were the ones who had old, paid-for machinery. And they started coming to Earl. "Earl, my old 1066 is losing power. Think you could take a look at the injector pump? Earl, where do you get parts for that old Oliver of yours? Earl, that Steiger of yours. What's the secret to keeping that old cat running so smooth?" He never turned anyone away. He'd wipe his greasy hands on a rag, pour them a cup of coffee from Martha's thermos in his shop, and talk them through the problem. He'd lend them a special tool or tell them about a salvage yard 2 counties over that might have the part they needed. He never mentioned the past. He never said, "I told you so." His vindication wasn't in words, it was in the steady, reliable rumble of his own machinery, in the paid-off deeds in his safe deposit box, in the simple, profound fact that he was still there. He was a survivor. His stubbornness had been reframed as wisdom. His caution was now seen as foresight. He farmed his own land and the Henderson place, nearly 1,000 acres in all. It was more work, but he managed. He hired a local boy part-time to help during planting and harvest, the son of a man who had lost his own farm. He taught the boy how to change the oil, how to grease fittings, how to listen to an engine and understand what it was telling you. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Earl was in his machine shed, doing a full tune-up on the Steiger. He was in his 70s now, his movements slower, his hands gnarled and scarred from a lifetime of work, but his eyes were still sharp. His grandson, a boy of 10 named Michael, sat on a 5-gallon bucket, watching him. "Why don't you get a new tractor, Grandpa?" Michael asked, his voice echoing in the big metal building. "Like the ones on TV, with computers and GPS." Earl paused, a wrench in his hand. He looked at the massive Caterpillar V8, its yellow paint faded and stained. He could smell the familiar scent of diesel and grease that clung to it like a second skin. "Well, Michael," he said, turning to face the boy, "this old tractor and I, we have an agreement. I take care of her, and she takes care of me. There's no banker standing between us. Every dollar this machine earns, short of fuel and oil, is ours. That man on the TV, he doesn't own his tractor. The bank does. He's not a farmer, he's a manager for the bank. There's a difference." He pointed with the wrench at the engine block. This I can understand. I can fix it. If that fancy new tractor breaks, you've got to call a man with a laptop, and he'll send you a bill that would make your eyes water. We don't buy what we can't afford, and we fix what we own. That's how we stay." He turned back to the engine, fitting the wrench onto a bolt on the valve cover. "Hand me that rag, will you?" Michael handed him the rag. He watched as his grandfather's strong, weathered hands expertly tightened the bolt, his movements sure and steady. The lesson wasn't about tractors, it was about independence. It was about the quiet strength of standing on your own 2 feet, on your own land, beholden to no one. A little while later, Earl climbed into the cab. "Want to hear her run?" he asked. Michael's eyes lit up. He scrambled up the ladder and stood on the platform next to the seat. Earl turned the key. The starter whined, and then the big Cat V8 erupted into its thunderous, hammering roar. The whole shed seemed to vibrate with the raw power of it. It wasn't a smooth, quiet hum like the new machines. It was the sound of defiance, of resilience, of survival. It was the sound of a heart that was still beating, strong and true. Earl throttled it up, and a plume of black smoke billowed from the chrome stack before thinning out. He looked at his grandson, a rare, wide smile creasing his weathered face. In the boy's wide, wondering eyes, he saw the future. The farm would endure.